The couple jumped apart and to their feet, staring wide-eyed down the long slope to the village, at the swarming forms, at the large plume of smoke, too large to come from any chimney, rising from one of the houses.
The goblins!
Hundreds of miles away, in a wind-swept foreboding land called the Barbican, in a deep cave in a mountain called Ada, the dactyl basked in the sensation of fear. The demon creature could feel the screams of those dying in Dundalis, though it had no idea where the battle was being waged. This was an action of a rogue goblin chieftain, perhaps, or one of the many Powery raiding parties, acting on their own initiative, bringing misery to the wretched humans. The dactyl could not take direct credit, but that mattered little. It had awakened, darkness rising, and already its influence was spreading throughout Corona. Already the goblins, the Poweries, or one of the other races the demon would claim as minions, had felt that awakening and had been given the courage to act. The creature flexed its great wings and settled back in the throne it had shaped from the obsidian that had formerly served as its tomb. Yes, the dark vibrations were running strong through the stone, the sensation of war, of human agony.
It is good to be awake.
Elbrian and Pony were stunned and terrified for many seconds. It was too unreal, too beyond their experience and expectations. Images assaulted them, mingling with imagined scenes even more horrifying. And amid all of it, welled utter denial, the hope against obvious reality that this simply could not be happening.
No.
Giuseppe moved first, a single tiny step, her arm reaching out helplessly. That almost involuntary motion seemed to break her trance.
Mother! No!
Pony ran full out for home. Elbrian thought to call out for her, but indecision held his voice and kept him from immediately following. What should he do? What were his responsibilities? A warrior would know these things. With great effort, Elbrian tore his gaze from the dreadful spectacle below and glanced all around. He should organize his friends. Yes, that was the course, he decided. He would gather together his scouts, perhaps even call in the older scouts from the Vale, and charge down into Dundalis in tight formation, anchoring the defense. But time was against him. He glanced about again, turned to the evergreen and caribou moss valley, cupped his hands to his mouth to call out and bring in the patrol of older men. Elbrian fell back behind the twin pines, catching the shout in his throat. Just over the ridge, facing away from him, he saw the nearly bald head, the pointed ears, the chalky yellow skin of an enemy. With trembling fingers, Elbrian retrieved his short sword, and then he sank even deeper into the hollow, paralyzed with terror. Pony wasn't armed, having left her club back at the ridge. She didn't care, for she wasn't really running into battle. The girl was running to find her mother and father, to feel their comforting hugs, to hear her mother telling her that everything would be all right. She wanted to be a little girl again, wrapped tight in her bedsheets, and tighter in mother's embrace, waking from a nightmare. This time, though, she was awake. This time, the screams were real. Pony ran on desperately, blinded by tears. She stumbled to the base of what she thought was a tree, then nearly fainted as it shifted suddenly, as the Fomorian giant, huge club in hand, took a long step away from her. If she had had any breath in her lungs, she would have screamed. And if she had screamed, the giant would have noticed her and squashed her where she stood. But its focus was the village, and not some insignificant little girl, and in a few loping strides, it left Pony far behind. She scrambled back to her feet, picked up a couple of rocks of a good size for throwing, and ran on, taking a course that would parallel, but not too closely, that of the giant. Now, as she entered the area of battle, as she saw the confusion, the fierce fighting, the dead bodies on the road, she was no more a little girl. Now she remembered her training, forced herself to think clearly and concisely. Goblins swarmed everywhere, and Pony spotted at least two other giants, 15 feet tall and perhaps 1,000 pounds of chiseled muscle. Her friends and family could not win. That logical adult part of Pony, the part that knew that the time of fending off nightmares with bedsheets was long past, told her without doubt that Dandalis could not survive. The rules of survival, taught to every child in Wilderland settlements, declared that the first priority in any catastrophe was to save the village. If that failed, the next task was to save as many individuals as possible. Pony picked her way around the back of the nearest houses, moving in and out of the shadows. She peeked around the corner and stood transfixed. On the main road of Dandalis, just on the other side of his house, a fierce battle raged. Pony saw Old One Winden first, standing tall in the middle of the human line.
Circle around me! Form up and hold the line! Fight! Fight with everything you have!
He formed a group of 20 men and women into a tight circle as enemies came at them from nearly every direction. Pony's first instincts were to try and join that battle group, but she quickly surmised that she would never get in. Then Pony noticed the man behind Old One, carrying wildly as two goblins prodded at him with sharp spears. It was her father. Elbrian held his breath. He didn't know what to do, then cursed himself silently for what he had already done. In the hollow of the Twin Pines, he had lost sight of his enemy, the first and often fatal mistake. Now he had to work hard to deny his terror, had to climb above the emotion and the physical barrier, and remember the many lessons his father had given him. A warrior knows his enemy, locates his enemy, and watches its every move. Silently mouthing that litany, Elbrian inched his face toward the edge of the pine. He hesitated momentarily at the very last instant, certain the goblin was just on the other side, weapon poised to smash him as soon as he peeked around.
A warrior knows his enemy.
A sudden shift of wind brought the field beyond the pines back into view, and Elbrian nearly collapsed with relief when he saw the goblin had not moved and was still facing away from him, staring into the northern valley. That relief fast transformed into a sinking feeling as Elbrian realized the meaning of the creature's positioning. The patrol in the valley had been spotted, perhaps had even been already engaged, and this goblin had been set as sentry, watching for any other potential human reinforcements, while its companions sacked the village. That thought sparked anger in the young man, enough to overcome his fear. He clenched more tightly his short sword, and slowly brought one leg up under him. Without hesitation, or if he paused, he knew his courage surely would falter. Elbrian slipped out from behind the protection of the tree. Half walking, half crawling, he moved closer to the goblin, quickly covering a third of the distance. Then he wanted to turn back, to run into the hollow and cover his face. The sounds behind him, from his home, bolstered him, as did the smell of burning wood carried by the wind up to the ridge. With a grimace of determination, Elbrian halved the distance to his foe. No turning back now. He scanned the area, and as soon as he was confident this creature was alone, he stood up and rushed out. Even as the goblin began to turn, Elbrian's sword came down hard on its head. The goblin staggered weirdly, dropped its weapon, and fell to its knees. Its head lolled from side to side. Elbrian saw the bright red gash, the white of split bone, the grayish brain. The goblin stopped moving. Its chin came to rest on its chest, and it held the kneeling pose.
Dead?
The weight of Elbrian's first kill descended upon him, bowing his shoulders, nearly driving him to his knees. Again it was the smell of his burning village that cleared his head. He had no time now to ponder, and any sympathetic notions that he might have captured the goblin instead of killing it seemed perfectly ridiculous. He looked ahead at the evergreen vale, and noted to his dismay that a fight was going on down there. Then he looked back at the larger battle for Dandalis, to where his parents were fighting, to where Pony had run.
Pony!
Before Elbrian even consciously knew what he was doing, he saw the trees going past him in a blur as he sprinted down the slope toward Dandalis. Tony made her way around the house, inching toward the battle, wondering how she might get past the ring of goblins to stand beside her father. The sound froze her in place, and she leaned heavily on the frame of the house for support. She took a moment to consider where she was, whose house this was.
No time for that.
Tony focused on the battle raging on the road. Again her shoulders sagged, for though many goblins lay dead or dying on the bloodied ground about the ring of desperate fighters, several humans were down as well. And the goblin ranks, for all the carnage, remained deep and seemed undiminished. Above it all stood Olwan, proud and strong and unshakable. He clobbered yet another goblin, bashing in its ugly skull, then raised his arm.
Stay together! Keep fighting! Hold the line!
Tony blinked curiously, for Olwan's arm did not come down, seemed to be going up, up, up. She saw the look of horror and pain that came over the man, then looked higher, past his stretched shoulder, his elbow. The giant's hand covered the tall man's entire forearm. Blocked by the wall of the house, Tony couldn't follow the man's ascent. She wanted to yell out for someone to help doomed Olwan, wanted to scream simply for the sake of screaming. And then Olwan came flying back into sight, falling in a broken heap on the road, right in the midst of the valiant fighters. Their ranks broke apart. They ran every which way, most getting no more than a couple of strides before being buried under a wave of swarming goblins. Tony lost sight of her father immediately, mercifully. She tried to sort out the mob, saw another person, the woman who had taught her to read and write, get pulled down to the ground, saw the goblin's spear fast following. Tony turned away, stumbling to the back of the house, holding her churning stomach. There were no lines of defense anymore, no organized pockets of resistance. Tony didn't know where to turn, where to run. She saw the image of dead Olwan again, and the last glimpse of her father. She turned back toward the road, hoping that her father would come for her, would somehow rush out of the jumble and scoop her away from the danger, would make everything better, as he'd always done. As if in a grotesque mockery of that hope, a goblin marched around that corner. Tony hurled one of her stones at the creature and ran off. Anger held her in place just around the back of the house. She stopped and braced herself, measuring the goblin's footsteps. As it rounded the corner, the girl snapped back her elbow with all her strength. She caught the creature right under the chin. Tony spun and jumped on it, flailing wildly with both fists. Stronger than its little body would indicate, the goblin finally pushed her aside and turned its spear. Elbrian caught the trunk of a young maple and swung about it, turning in the direction of the voice. Carly Dan Aubrey, the 9-year-old scout, staggered toward him, his face ashen, both hands clenched firmly to his right side at his waist. Elbrian saw the dark stain near those hands. Elbrian ran out to meet him and caught him as he fell. The older boy moved quickly to inspect the wound, forcing Carly's hands away. Elbrian grimaced, and his hand brushed against the broken tip of the spear jutting from Carly's side. Elbrian pulled back his trembling hand, staring wide-eyed at the bright blood that now covered it. Carly clutched desperately at the wound again, but he couldn't hope to stem the blood. Elbrian forced himself to remain steady, to think clearly. He had to get his own shirt off and use it to somehow wrap the wound, and quickly. He tore off his overcoat and pulled open his leather vest, quickly unbuttoning the sleeves of his white shirt. Then Elbrian saw the goblin, coming fast, half a spear in its hands. It raised the shaft like a club, bearing down on him. Elbrian grabbed for his short sword, tried to bring it up in front of him, and fell back as the goblin dove upon him. Down they rolled together. Elbrian's sword was up against the creature's side, and it cut in a bit, but the angle was wrong. And the goblin's grip surprisingly strong, preventing the boy from dropping the weapon home. Over and over they rolled, tumbling down the slope, punching and thrashing. The ugly goblin face, all twisted teeth and long pointy nose, was barely inches from Elbrian's face, and closer still when the creature began to butt the boy. Elbrian struggled harder, but the goblin wouldn't let him drive his sword home. Elbrian tugged more fiercely with his other hand instead, increasing the pace of the roll. He caught his ankles on a tree trunk, halting his momentum. The goblin careened right over him, its own weight forcing it down on Elbrian's sword. The creature kicked and thrashed, flopping like a landed fish. Elbrian at first tried to defend himself, but when that seemed futile, went on the offensive instead, brutally turning and twisting his blade. Elbrian's thoughts came back in a terrifying rush, and he tore free his sword and began hacking wildly, cutting the goblin again and again. He crawled out from under the thing, but kept on attacking it, savagely, primally, his blows wrought of sheer terror. The thought of Carly Dan Aubrey brought him back to his senses. He dashed back up the slope, finally getting to the boy.
Cold!
Elbrian fell to his knees, reaching for the wound, gingerly touching the spear and wondering if he should pull it free. He looked at the boy and held his breath. But Carly was dead. Pony ran off, stumbled and fell, then scrambled on all fours, anything to get away. The goblin was behind her. She could imagine it, readying its spear, lining up her vulnerable back. She fell around a corner, flat on her face. Realizing she hadn't been hit by anything, Pony put her feet back under her and ran on. Around the back of the house, Thomas Alt, Pony's father, tore his dagger free and let the dead goblin fall to the ground. He looked plaintively at the corner around which his daughter had run, hoping, praying she would somehow escape. Thomas had done all he could. The band of pursuing goblins closed the distance to them. He prayed Pony would get away. Before Elbrian could start back toward the town, he saw the shadows moving among the trees in the area from which Carly had come. He knew these were not his other friends, knew instinctively the others had fallen. He moved slowly, quietly, away from Carly's body, taking cover behind a larger tree. 7 goblins came into sight, trotting easily down the slope. Elbrian wanted to jump out at them, to slash them all. Wisdom overruled his rage, though, and he stayed hidden and let them pass. Then he stalked after them, his bloody sword in his bloody hand, hoping one of the creatures would stray from its friends. The smoke was growing thicker down in the village now. The screams had diminished, but when he crossed an area that offered him a clear view of Dundalis, Elbrian saw the scrambling forms were still thick about the place. The young man knew it was hopeless, knew that his village was lost, knew all of his friends, his parents, his pony were gone. Elbrian knew it, yet he didn't slow his pace. He did not alter his course. He was beyond grief, beyond logic, with no tears to cry. He would go down to Dundalis. He would kill every goblin he could catch. Pony saw the dead, saw the dying. She didn't know why she hadn't yet been caught, but as she darted from shadow to shadow, from the side of one burning building to the next, she knew that her luck would not hold out for long. All thought of rescuing anyone was gone. All that she wanted now was to get away, far away. But the roads were thick with goblins. Groups of the ugly creatures ran into each house, ransacked the place, and then set it ablaze. They showed no mercy. The noose was getting tighter, Pony knew. As villagers died, more and more goblins were free to run about. She looked in every direction, trying to find some course out of the town to the trees. But there was no escape. No way to get beyond Dundalis without being seen. And there were other goblins in the woods, coming in a few at a time. No escape. Pony squeezed in tight between 2 buildings and put her head against a wall. She wondered if it would be better to run out into the road and get it over with.
Better that than to wait.
But she found she couldn't do it. That her most basic instinct for survival wouldn't let her. She felt the heat against her hands as this house too started to burn. Now where could she run? The girl cocked her head, suddenly realizing exactly where she was. This was Shane McMichael's house in front of her. Olwan Wyndon's right behind her. Olwan's house. Elbrian's house.
Elbrian's new house.
Pony remembered the building of the place only 2 years previously. The whole village had buzzed about the house because Olwan Wyndon was laying a stone foundation. Pony fell to her knees and began to scrape the ground at the base of Olwan's house. Her fingers bled. She felt the heat growing behind her, but she dug on desperately. Then her hand broke through into an open area. She reached deeper, perhaps 1.5 feet down, and her hand met cold, wet ground. Olwan had used large slabs for the base, and as Pony suspected, the house hadn't completely settled. The smoke grew thick about Pony. Olwan's house too was going up in flames. Still she dug, widening the hole, trying desperately to squeeze under the slab. Elbrian didn't have long to wait. The Goblin band, sentries apparently, and not part of the attacking force, did not continue down toward Dundalis, but split ranks and filtered left and right into the trees. The angry young man went left, shadowing a group of 3. He saw the houses burning in Dundalis, was close enough to realize that his own house was among them. That only fueled the young man's outrage. He stalked quietly from tree to tree, and when one of the goblins paused and fell behind the others, he was quickly to the spot. The kill was swift, a single thrust through the creature's ribs. Elbrian tore free his sword and started to run, but too late. He swiped left and right, picking off a pair of thrusting spears as the 2 other goblins bore down on him. Their eyes, so full of glee, so uncaring for their fallen comrade, unnerved Elbrian, and he tried hard not to look at them, tried to concentrate on their stabbing spears. All the while, he was backtracking, realizing he had to flee before the other group answered the howling. The goblin on his left came in hard and straight. Elbrian snapped his sword over and around the spear, angling it past on his right, and he skittered out to the left, up the slope, gaining the higher ground. All advantage was lost as the young man stumbled, the loose earth slipping out from under his foot. The other goblin ran around the back of its companion and moved higher, coming in at Elbrian from above. Desperately, Elbrian threw himself backward, put a foot under him, and kicked off, flying past the turning spear of the first goblin and rushing to get out of range of the second. Elbrian slashed out with his sword as he careened past. Then the world was spinning as Elbrian bounced and rolled. He finally controlled his slide and tried to angle himself so he could stop his roll and come up in a defensive posture. He expected the goblin, perhaps both of the creatures, to be right behind him. They weren't. The one Elbrian had slashed lay very still on the ground. Apparently he had hit it harder than he'd believed. The other was also on the ground. The only explanation Elbrian could think of was that one had charged at him as he had leapt away and had slammed hard against the ground or against a tree trunk. Not one to argue with good fortune, Elbrian scrambled to his feet. All of a sudden, Elbrian was flying once more, sidelong this time. He slammed hard against a tree trunk as he came around. Elbrian staggered to his feet. All hope flew from him as a Fomorian giant holding a club as large as Elbrian's entire body casually walked toward him. The young man glanced all around. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He braced himself, used the solid tree as support. When the giant was within one huge stride, Elbrian leapt out. Trying to confuse it with sheer savagery, Elbrian stabbed and slashed, came in close to the monster's knees, and stabbed again. Then rolled right between the giant's legs. But the giant had seen the move dozens of times in its battles with little folk. Elbrian got halfway through before the giant clamped his knees together, holding the youth so securely he could barely draw breath. Elbrian tried to stab the monster again, but the giant squeezed even tighter. He managed to turn sideways. From that perspective, he could see the giant's club rise up over its head. A sickening feeling washed over Elbrian. Stubborn to the end, he stabbed again as hard as he could, then closed his eyes. Suddenly, the air seemed to come alive. The giant released its grip, and O'Brien fell to the ground. He scrambled out, running on for several steps. Then he turned, regarding the giant, who was dancing and slapping at the air. Dots of red, like grotesque chicken pox, covered the giant's face and arms. O'Brien realized that the injuries were caused by bolts, small arrows, the likes of which he had never seen. Scores and scores of small arrows filled the air all about him, but they hardly seemed to stop the behemoth. The Fomorian charged ahead with its cudgel going high. O'Brien, puny and helpless beneath it, held aloft his short sword, though he couldn't possibly deflect such a mighty blow. The next volley was concentrated, 60 arrows flying fast for the giant's face and throat, 60 bolts that looked indeed like a swarm of bees. The Fomorian staggered once, twice, and then again, as the bolts burrowed in, one on top of the other, a dozen on top of the previous dozen. The Fomorian tried to move forward, back toward its prey, but before it could get anywhere near to the young man, the giant went down, choking in its own blood. O'Brien never saw it. He fainted, dead away.